The morning sun painted the skyline of the city in a golden hue, bouncing off the mirrored towers that reached into the clouds like symbols of ambition and power. Inside one of those towers, Rhodes Enterprises was already alive with motion. The rhythmic clicking of keyboards, the soft hum of printers, the murmured greetings exchanged between co-workers who were trying to mask their exhaustion behind polite smiles and caffeine. Among them was Olivia Carter, a 28-year-old marketing executive who still carried the uncertainty of someone trying to prove she deserved the chair she sat in. She had joined the company 8 months earlier, after a long struggle to find stability, and though her performance had been strong, she often felt invisible among the high-achieving, confident personalities who filled the 15th floor. Olivia was the kind of person who noticed everything but rarely said much. Her world revolved around small efforts, arriving early, checking details twice, staying late when no one else wanted to. Yet she always wondered if anyone noticed. That morning, she stepped out of the elevator with her laptop bag and a caramel latte, balancing it against a stack of folders that seemed to have multiplied overnight. The smell of freshly polished marble filled the air, and she exhaled slowly, preparing herself for another day of navigating office politics and quiet competition. The marketing department stretched before her in a clean, open-plan design, with glass-walled offices that offered no privacy, but projected prestige. The executives who sat behind those transparent barriers lived in a different world, a world she admired and resented in equal measure. Before she could settle at her desk, a familiar voice called her name. Nina Hayes, her closest friend in the company, appeared beside her with a wide smile and a coffee of her own. Nina had an effortless warmth, the kind that turned dull Mondays into survivable days. She was lively, outspoken, and possessed the rare ability to make even the most rigid managers laugh. "Did you see the email?" Nina whispered conspiratorially, sliding into the spare chair next to Olivia. "We landed the Henderson account. Damien closed the deal himself last night." At the mention of his name, Olivia instinctively glanced toward the corner office at the far end of the floor, the one with the floor-to-ceiling glass and the panoramic view of downtown. Damien Rhodes, the founder and CEO of Rhodes Enterprises, was a figure wrapped in quiet legend. At 34, he had built the company from a one-person consultancy in his small apartment to a multi-million-dollar firm employing over 300 people. His face had appeared in magazines, business forums, and entrepreneurial conferences, yet those who worked under him knew him as distant, controlled, and intimidatingly precise. Every word he spoke carried weight. Every decision he made seemed calculated 3 moves ahead. "Of course he did," Olivia murmured, turning on her computer. "That man could convince a desert to buy umbrellas." Nina grinned mischievously. "Tell me about it. I still don't understand how he's single. Have you looked at him lately? Those eyes could melt titanium." Olivia chuckled, keeping her voice low. "He's definitely easy on the eyes, but he's so serious all the time. I don't think I've ever seen him smile. Maybe he's just married to his work. Maybe he just hasn't met the right person," Nina teased, leaning in closer. "Someone who could make him loosen up." Olivia rolled her eyes. "Good luck to whoever tries. Honestly, I think he's probably gay anyway." She said it without malice, just an idle, flippant comment tossed into the air to keep the conversation light. But as the words left her lips, Nina's eyes widened, her face draining of color. She looked past Olivia's shoulder, her mouth falling open in silent horror. Olivia froze. The air shifted behind her, heavy with a subtle scent of expensive cologne, something dark, woody, and undeniably masculine. Every instinct screamed at her to stay still, but curiosity forced her to turn. Standing 3 feet away, folder in hand, was Damien Rhodes himself. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, deep, calm, and dangerously perceptive, locked on hers with an intensity that sent a jolt through her entire body. The rest of the office seemed to fade. Conversation stilled. Even the hum of the air conditioning felt muted under the weight of that silence. "Mr. Rhodes," she began, her voice trembling, but he stepped closer. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, confident in a way that made her heart race. Before she could finish her apology, he reached out, his hand brushing her chin lightly. The gesture was unexpected, not rough, not angry, but almost thoughtful. His thumb traced the edge of her jaw for the briefest second, and then, to the collective shock of everyone within sight, he leaned down and kissed her. The world stopped. It wasn't a fleeting kiss, nor was it reckless. It was steady, certain, a kiss that carried a quiet authority rather than desire. Olivia's mind blanked. Her breath caught in her chest. Her heart thundered like it wanted to escape. When he finally pulled away, she could see her stunned reflection in the glass walls behind him. His expression remained calm, his voice steady as he said, "Next time you have questions about my preferences, Miss Carter, you can ask me directly." He turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence that cracked like glass seconds later when the office erupted into whispers. Olivia sat frozen, her fingers trembling around the coffee cup she hadn't realized she was still holding. Nina was gripping her arm, half laughing, half hyperventilating. "Oh my God, did that just happen?" "He kissed you in front of everyone!" I can't. I need to leave the planet," Olivia stammered. But her voice was lost amid the hum of speculation. The entire department buzzed like a hive. Phones subtly raised under desks, faces pressed against monitors pretending to work while they replayed the memory in their heads. Damien's kiss became instant legend, and Olivia, the quiet, hard-working girl no one noticed, was suddenly the center of the company's gossip universe. The hours that followed were unbearable. Olivia could feel eyes on her every time she moved. Her email notifications blinked with curious messages disguised as check-ins, and Nina hovered protectively, fending off anyone who dared approach. Yet beneath the mortification there was another emotion, a dangerous, confusing one she didn't want to acknowledge. Because when Damien had kissed her, something inside her had responded. It wasn't attraction exactly. It was recognition. The feeling that someone who lived in another stratosphere had seen her, not as an employee, not as a name on a payroll sheet, but as a person. By late afternoon, Olivia had given up pretending to work. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, searching for meaning in every gesture, every glance. Was he angry, mocking, testing her? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and the longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became. Finally, at 5:30, when most of the floor had emptied, her desk phone rang. The internal line. Her stomach dropped. Only one person could be calling. "Miss Carter," came Damien's voice, smooth and composed. "Could you bring the Henderson files to my office before you leave? I need to review them." Her mouth went dry. "Of course, Mr. Rhodes, I'll be there in a minute." She gathered the files, her fingers trembling slightly as she walked toward his office. The building had grown quiet. Even the cleaning crew on the far side seemed distant. The only sound was the rhythmic tap of her heels on the marble floor. She paused outside his door, drawing in a shaky breath before knocking softly. "Come in," his voice replied. The office was immaculate, dark wood, glass, minimalist decor. Everything spoke of discipline and order. Damien stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the golden city lights. He turned as she entered, and for a moment their eyes met in silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. "You wanted the Henderson files," Olivia said, placing them on his desk. Her voice was quiet, respectful, yet she couldn't hide the nervous tremor. "Yes." He walked around the desk, standing close enough that she could feel the subtle warmth radiating from him. "And I wanted to address what happened this morning." Her breath caught. She braced herself for a reprimand, a lecture, maybe even termination. But his tone was measured, not angry. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice even. "It was unprofessional, and I owe you an apology." She blinked, startled. That was the last thing she had expected. You don't have to apologize, sir. I shouldn't have said what I said." It was thoughtless. His gaze softened slightly. "We all say things we don't mean when we're comfortable around friends. But I don't want you to think I took offense." He paused, studying her expression with that same analytical calm. "I reacted because I wanted to make a point about assumptions. They're dangerous, Miss Carter. They limit how we see people, and sometimes they limit how we see ourselves." Olivia stood frozen, unsure what to say. The tension in the room wasn't hostility anymore. It was something deeper, a strange mixture of authority, respect, and curiosity. "You're right," she admitted quietly. "I was wrong," he nodded. "You're not the first person to misjudge me, and you won't be the last. But I hope next time you'll choose to ask before deciding who someone is." His tone softened again. "Good night, Olivia." Hearing her first name from him felt oddly intimate, like a door had cracked open to something she didn't fully understand. She nodded mutely, turned, and left the office. As the door closed behind her, Damien watched her go, the faintest trace of a smile ghosting his lips. He hadn't planned the morning's event. It had been impulsive, something that broke his own rules, but for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't regret it. Olivia Carter was different, and for the first time in years, he was curious. That night, Olivia lay awake, replaying every second of the day, the shock, the humiliation, the strange calm of his apology. Beneath all of it was a spark she hadn't felt in years, the realization that her life had just shifted. She didn't know how or where it would lead, but she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Olivia Carter woke with a dull ache behind her eyes, the kind that came not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of too many thoughts pressing against her mind. The sunlight seeped through the curtains, scattering across her small apartment like fragments of gold, but even that gentle warmth couldn't calm the storm within her. She stared at her reflection in the mirror as she buttoned her blouse, her movements slow and deliberate, replaying the events of yesterday in her head again and again. Every second of that encounter with Damian Rhodes had imprinted itself into her memory with painful clarity. The stunned silence of the office, the heat of his hands against her skin, the way his eyes had seemed to look through her rather than at her, and then that single, piercing line that still echoed in her head. "Next time you have questions about my preferences, ask me directly." She had never meant to insult him, yet the outcome had exploded far beyond anything she could have imagined. And now, as she prepared to face another day at Rhodes Enterprises, she knew that she would be walking into an office filled not with tasks and deadlines, but with whispers. When she arrived, the atmosphere on the 15th floor was unmistakably different. Conversations halted as she passed. Laughter quieted into murmurs. It wasn't cruelty, at least not yet, but curiosity, the kind that stripped privacy from a person one glance at a time. Olivia felt her shoulders tense, her stomach knotting as she made her way to her desk. Her computer screen flickered to life, but the words on the monitor blurred in front of her eyes. She could feel it. The collective gaze of those who had been there yesterday, of those who had heard about it secondhand, and of those who pretended they didn't care while leaning just a little closer to listen. Nina, ever the protective friend, arrived moments later with her usual coffee in hand, but even she looked uneasy this morning. "Don't let them get to you," she whispered, her tone somewhere between encouragement and guilt. "They're just talking because it's something new. It'll die down soon." Olivia nodded, trying to believe it, but the truth was things like this never truly died down in offices like theirs. Every corporate environment had its ecosystem, and scandal, no matter how unintended, was food that kept it alive. Before she could respond, the glass door of the corner office opened and Damian stepped out. He was dressed as always in precision, a charcoal suit, an expression that revealed nothing, his presence commanding without needing to demand. The hallway seemed to part instinctively as he passed, employees straightening, conversations cutting mid-sentence. His authority wasn't loud. It was the kind of power that came from self-control, from a life so disciplined that even his silence spoke louder than words. His gaze swept the room briefly, not lingering on her but brushing past just long enough to make her pulse quicken. Then, without a word, he disappeared into the conference room with the executive team. The tension he left behind clung to the air like humidity before a storm. As the hours dragged on, Olivia tried to lose herself in work, but her focus fractured under the pressure. Every email she sent felt scrutinized. Every interaction with coworkers carried an undertone of discomfort, as though they were all wondering what really happened between her and the CEO. When lunchtime came, she found herself sitting alone in the break room, staring at her untouched salad, listening to the low hum of conversation from the next table. She didn't have to hear her name to know they were talking about her. The occasional glance in her direction was enough. Her chest tightened with a mix of humiliation and anger. Anger not at them, but at herself, for having said something so careless, for having lost control of a moment that now defined her. She thought of quitting, of packing her things and walking away from this suffocating tension. But then another thought took root, a sharper, prouder one. No, I worked too hard to be here. I won't let one mistake erase all of it. By mid-afternoon, her resolve was tested again when her inbox chimed with an internal memo from Damian himself. It was brief, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. Subject: Henderson account review. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Miss Carter, Please join the strategy presentation with the executive committee. Prepare a summary of projected engagement metrics and creative deliverables. Dear Olivia read the message twice, her heart racing. He was including her in an executive-level presentation. Normally, only senior managers attended those. Was this a punishment disguised as a test? Or was it something else, a chance to prove herself? Either way, she couldn't afford to fail. She spent the rest of the day preparing, pouring herself into data sheets, design concepts, and market trends until her desk was covered with notes and printouts. As the office emptied for the evening, she remained, the only light in her section glowing softly against the dimming skyline outside. When the silence grew too heavy, she looked up and realized that Damien's office light was still on as well. For a moment, she debated leaving quietly, but something drew her toward that glass door. Maybe it was the need for closure, or maybe it was the faint, irrational hope that the man behind that door wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. She gathered her courage and knocked gently. A pause, then his voice, calm and deep. "Come in." He didn't look up immediately when she entered. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened, and there was a rare fatigue in his posture that softened his usually sharp aura. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "You're still here," he said, his tone neutral. "Most people run home at the first chance." "I wanted to make sure the presentation for tomorrow is perfect," she replied, trying to sound steady, though her pulse betrayed her. "It's important. I didn't want to risk missing anything." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes assessing, not in a predatory way, but in the measured observation of a man who noticed effort, who valued discipline. "Good," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "That's what I like about you, Miss Carter. You don't crumble under pressure even when you think you might." She blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. For a moment, the silence between them shifted from awkward to something almost human, almost gentle. Then he added, "But you also need to learn not to let people's opinions define you. Offices are full of noise. Let it in, and it'll drown you. Tune it out, and you'll rise above it." Olivia exhaled slowly, the words sinking deep into her. He wasn't just addressing the gossip. He was giving her something more valuable, perspective. "That's easier said than done," she murmured. "Everything worth doing is," he replied. Then his gaze softened again. "Yesterday was unfortunate. For both of us." I reacted impulsively. "I shouldn't have put you in that position, but I also saw something in you, a spark. You're sharper than most people give you credit for. Don't let this incident reduce you to a rumor. Let it fuel you instead." For the first time since the chaos began, Olivia felt something other than shame. She felt challenged. It wasn't about the kiss anymore, or the whispers, or the humiliation. It was about growth, about taking a misstep and turning it into a lesson. She nodded slowly, her voice quiet but resolute. "I understand." When she left his office, the night air hit her face like a blessing. The city lights stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time in days she smiled. There was still fear inside her, still uncertainty, but it was joined by a new kind of determination. She would not be defined by gossip. She would not let one reckless moment dictate her story. She would write a new chapter, and it would start tomorrow. The next day dawned crisp and clear, and by 10 o'clock Olivia stood in the executive conference room, her heart pounding but her posture firm. Around her sat people she had admired from a distance, department heads, senior strategists, and at the far end, Damien Rhodes himself. When her turn came, she rose and began her presentation. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, confidence bloomed. The numbers she had spent hours refining came alive on the screen. Her insights drew nods of approval. When she finished, a brief silence followed, then Damien spoke, his tone calm and clear. "Excellent work, Miss Carter. This is exactly the level of analysis we need moving forward." Those words hit harder than applause. For the first time since joining the company, she felt seen not as a background employee, but as someone who belonged in that room. When the meeting ended, Damien lingered as others filed out. He met her eyes briefly and said, "You handled yourself well. Keep doing that, and people will stop whispering and start listening." As she walked back to her desk, a quiet pride settled in her chest. The same people who had looked at her with curiosity yesterday now nodded in acknowledgement. It wasn't acceptance yet, but it was the beginning of something better. Respect. And beneath that, something subtler began to stir. A mutual recognition between her and Damien. something neither of them could yet define but both could feel. It wasn't romance. It was connection born of challenge, of two minds testing each other in ways neither expected. That night, as she left the building, she caught sight of her reflection in the lobby's glass wall. The woman staring back at her looked different, stronger, steadier, no longer a shadow at the edge of the office. The kiss that had once felt like her undoing had become, in its strange and twisted way, the catalyst for her awakening. And high above, in his darkened office, Damian Rhodes watched her step out into the city lights, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossing his face. He knew talent when he saw it, but this was something else. There was spirit in that woman, and spirit was far rarer than skill. As he turned back to his work, a quiet thought crossed his mind, one that would echo in the days to come. Sometimes destiny doesn't arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks into your office by accident and says something foolish, but it's exactly what you needed to hear. The days that followed the Henderson presentation marked the quiet beginning of something that neither Olivia Carter nor Damian Rhodes fully understood, though both felt it like a subtle current humming beneath the surface of their professional routines. For Olivia, the air inside Rhodes Enterprises had begun to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first warm breeze before spring announces itself. The stares that once carried judgment had softened. The whispers that used to sting had started to fade into silence. People now approached her not out of curiosity, but out of respect, asking for her input on reports, seeking her help with campaigns, and occasionally inviting her to meetings she had once only dreamed of attending. It wasn't that the memory of the kiss had disappeared. Gossip in an office never truly died, but Olivia's quiet determination had rewritten the narrative. She was no longer the girl who said something foolish. She was the woman who stood tall after the storm. Yet beneath the outward calm there was turbulence within her, an internal dialogue she couldn't quite silence. She found herself watching Damian more often now, not out of infatuation but fascination. There was something about him that intrigued her beyond his success, beyond the polished exterior and controlled composure. He was a man who never wasted a word, whose temper was cold rather than hot, whose decisions carried weight because they were always made from logic, never emotion. But Olivia was beginning to suspect that under all that calculation lived something else, something hidden, maybe even wounded. There were moments when she caught it, fleeting glimpses between his sentences, the way his jaw tightened when someone mentioned his past ventures, the brief shadow that crossed his face when he stared too long at the skyline from his office window. She had begun to wonder if the world's perception of Damian Rhodes, the perfect, unshakable billionaire, was as incomplete as her own assumptions had once been. One Thursday morning, a sudden opportunity arrived that would test everything Olivia had rebuilt. The company was preparing for one of its biggest bids yet, a global partnership proposal with ArcLight Communications, a contract that could double Rhodes Enterprises' annual revenue. The responsibility of assembling the presentation team fell directly to Damian, and to everyone's shock, he chose Olivia as lead strategist. The announcement sent ripples through the office. Some congratulated her sincerely. Others smiled with the thin politeness of envy. Olivia, meanwhile, sat in quiet disbelief when her name was called during the briefing. Damian's tone had been firm, leaving no room for argument. Miss Carter will coordinate the creative direction and client engagement narrative. The board presentation is in 3 weeks. Make no mistake, this deal could change everything for us. That night, when the office had emptied and the glow of city lights shimmered against the glass walls, Olivia sat alone reviewing reports, her laptop illuminating the determined set of her features. She knew this was her chance not just to redeem her reputation, but to prove her worth beyond doubt. She worked late into the night, mapping out strategies, identifying weaknesses, building narratives that connected data to emotion. It was close to midnight when she heard footsteps approaching. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Damian's reflection appeared in the glass panel beside her, his expression unreadable as always. "Still here?" he asked, voice low and composed. "I wanted to make sure we're ahead of schedule," she replied without pausing, eyes fixed on her screen. "The client's expectations are high." "Expectations always are," he said simply, then moved closer, scanning the layout of her proposal over her shoulder. "You've structured this well. But you're focusing too much on logic. ArcLight's CEO isn't moved by numbers, he's moved by stories. What's our story here, Miss Carter? Olivia blinked, her mind pausing for a second. Our story? Yes, he said, turning to face her. Every company, every brand, every person sells something deeper than a product or service. They sell belief. The belief that they matter, that their vision has meaning. What we're really pitching is trust. What's the story that earns it? The question lingered in the air, heavier than any data point she'd analyzed. It wasn't just a question about marketing. It was about understanding people. And as she looked up at him, she realized something profound. This was how Damien thought, how he operated, how he built everything he owned. He didn't simply sell, he connected. That realization stirred something in her, a sense of awakening, of wanting to understand not just the business but the man who built it. I'll find that story, she said finally, her voice steady. And it'll be real. A faint smile ghosted his lips, the first genuine one she had ever seen. Good, because real stories are the only ones that last. The following weeks became a blur of relentless work and rising pressure. Olivia led her team with newfound confidence, her ideas sharper, her voice steadier in meetings. She found herself growing, not only in skill but in strength. There were nights she doubted herself, nights when exhaustion clawed at her resolve, but every time she remembered Damien's words, she pushed forward. What surprised her most, however, was how often Damien himself began to appear, not as a distant overseer but as a mentor. He joined her team's late-night brainstorming sessions, offering quiet guidance rather than orders. His presence, once intimidating, had transformed into something anchoring, a force that pushed her to think bigger and bolder, and yet, as their professional bond deepened, so did the unspoken tension between them. There were moments during those long nights when the office lights cast soft halos around them, when their conversations slipped from strategy to philosophy, about ambition, fear, loneliness, and the cost of success. Damien spoke rarely of himself, but the fragments he shared began to paint a picture that explained the stoic mask he wore. His rise hadn't been born from privilege. It had come from struggle, from betrayal, from years of learning that trust could be both the foundation and the downfall of greatness. He had built walls to protect what he had built, and perhaps, Olivia thought, to protect his heart as well. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of negotiations, she found him alone in the conference room, staring out at the city below. The skyline reflected in the glass made it look as if he were standing in two worlds, the one he ruled and the one that had cost him everything. "You work too much," she said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "So do you," he replied without turning. "That's why you're still here." She hesitated. "Can I ask you something personal?" He looked at her then, his eyes steady. "You can ask. Whether I answer depends on the question. Why do you do all this?" she asked quietly. "You have more money than most people could dream of. You've already built something incredible. What keeps you going?" His gaze drifted back toward the window, his reflection merging with the glittering skyline. "Because once you stop moving, the ghosts catch up," he said finally. "And I'm not ready to face mine yet." There was a silence that followed, a silence that felt sacred, as if she had been allowed to glimpse a corner of his soul no one else had ever seen. She wanted to ask more, to understand the pain behind that confession, but she knew better. Some truths weren't meant to be forced. So instead she simply said, "Maybe one day you'll stop running, and maybe the ghost will turn out to be lessons, not enemies." He looked at her again, and for the briefest moment something softened in his eyes, something almost vulnerable. "Maybe," he murmured. The ArcLight presentation arrived sooner than anyone expected. The boardroom was packed with executives, investors, and clients, the tension thick enough to taste. Olivia stood at the head of the room, heart hammering in her chest, but her voice calm as she began to speak. The story she told wasn't about profits or projections. It was about perseverance, about innovation rising from adversity, about trust forged through honesty. Every slide reflected not just the company's vision, but her own journey, her mistakes, her redemption, her growth. And when she finished, the room erupted in applause. Even the ArcLight CEO, a man known for his stoicism, leaned forward with a rare smile. "You've just sold me belief," he said. "And that's harder than selling numbers." When the meeting ended, Damien approached her quietly, a rare warmth in his expression. You didn't just present, he said. You inspired. That's what leadership looks like. For the first time since she joined the company, Olivia felt tears threaten at the edges of her composure, not of sadness, but of pride. She had climbed through humiliation, through doubt, through fire, and she had emerged, not as the woman defined by one reckless comment, but as someone reborn by her own resilience. That evening, as she left the building, the night air felt different, cleaner, freer, full of possibilities. She looked up at the tower that had once felt like a cage, and now felt like a chapter in a story still unfolding. Inside that building, she had faced her greatest humiliation, her hardest lessons, and her first taste of true strength. And high above in his office, Damien watched her silhouette vanish into the crowd below, a faint trace of pride flickering across his otherwise unreadable face. He had built empires, led teams, and conquered industries. But something about Olivia Carter's courage had reminded him that even the strongest people sometimes needed to be reminded what humanity looked like. That night, both of them in their separate worlds carried the same thought to sleep, that sometimes the greatest changes don't come from success or power. They come from the unexpected people who challenge us to see ourselves differently. And though neither said it aloud, both knew it. The story that began with an accidental insult was far from over. It had only just begun. In the weeks that followed the ArcLight victory, the energy inside Rhodes Enterprises changed entirely. The air that had once been thick with tension now pulsed with momentum and quiet pride. The company's name was suddenly being whispered in new circles. Articles praised Damien Rhodes for his leadership and innovation. But those inside the office knew the truth, that behind the headlines and boardroom accolades, much of the credit belonged to Olivia Carter. She had been the mind that crafted the narrative, the voice that gave emotion to strategy, and the heart that carried the team through sleepless nights. For Damien, that realization brought both admiration and something far more complicated, a feeling he couldn't categorize. Olivia had started as a curious employee who made a careless remark, but somewhere along the line she had evolved into something he couldn't quite define. She was his student, his ally, his equal in spirit, and perhaps, if he dared to admit it, a reflection of the humanity he had long buried beneath layers of ambition and self-protection. Olivia, for her part, found herself standing on ground she had never known before. Respected, valued, seen, her name began appearing on projects that once would have been out of reach. Senior directors sought her input. Clients requested her presence in meetings, and the quiet confidence she carried began to inspire others in ways she didn't even realize. Yet despite the recognition, she remained grounded. She still took her morning coffee with Nina, still smiled at the receptionists, still thanked the cleaning crew by name. What had changed was not her humility, but her sense of belonging. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just existing in the company, she was contributing to its heartbeat. But success, as Olivia would soon learn, comes with its own storms. The first tremor appeared one crisp Monday morning, disguised as a simple email from the finance department. It was an audit request, routine at first glance, but attached to it were numbers that didn't add up. Anomalies in the marketing budget, specifically linked to the ArcLight account. Olivia frowned as she reviewed them. They weren't errors, but deliberate adjustments. Someone had redirected project funds without authorization. She immediately reported it to the internal auditor, but within hours, whispers started circulating through the office again. This time darker, sharper. By noon, people were looking at her not with respect but suspicion. Her stomach dropped when she realized what had happened. Someone was framing her. That evening, she was summoned to Damien's office. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The usual calm elegance of the space felt colder, the distance between them more pronounced. Damien stood by his desk, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice controlled but heavy, "there are discrepancies in the ArcLight financial report. The adjustments were processed through your clearance code. Would you care to explain?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried the quiet authority of a man who demanded truth. Olivia's throat tightened. "I didn't authorize any changes, sir. I swear I didn't." He watched her carefully, his eyes studying every flicker of emotion in her face. "You're aware of how serious this is?" "Yes," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "But I also know I didn't do it. I've worked too hard to risk everything now. Someone must have used my login credentials. Please let me help you find out who. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then finally Damien nodded. I believe you, he said quietly. But the board will need proof. Until we have it, you'll have to step back from the upcoming projects. I'll handle the board myself. His words hit harder than any accusation could have. It wasn't just a professional setback. It felt like being stripped of her purpose. Yet beneath the sting, she caught something in his tone, a flicker of faith that gave her strength. He wasn't abandoning her. He was protecting her even if he couldn't show it openly. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking despite her efforts to hold it together. That night, while most of the city slept, Olivia stayed in the office alone, digging through data logs and email trails determined to find the truth. Hours passed and exhaustion blurred her vision, but she pressed on, her resolve fueled by a mix of anger and conviction. Just as dawn began to bleed into the horizon, she found it, a digital trail leading back to one of the senior analysts in finance. The discovery hit her like a surge of electricity. She printed the evidence, her hands trembling, and rushed to Damien's office. He was already there, as if he hadn't slept either, standing by the window with his tie loosened and a weary expression that softened when he saw her. Without a word, she placed the file on his desk. It was Marcus from finance, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. He rerouted the funds to cover his own losses. Here's the proof. Damien scanned the pages quickly, his eyes darkening with controlled fury. You did this alone? I couldn't let them think I was guilty, she said simply. I couldn't let you think that either. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw his composure falter. His voice lowered, gentler now. Olivia, you've done more than most people in this company would ever dare. You didn't just defend your name, you defended the integrity of this company. The scandal that followed was swift. Marcus was terminated. The board issued a formal apology to Olivia, and the company released a statement clearing her of all suspicion. The moment that had threatened to destroy her reputation had instead strengthened it. Yet beyond the public resolution, something deeper had shifted between her and Damien. The wall of hierarchy that had always separated them was beginning to crack, not out of romance but out of trust, mutual respect forged in fire. He began to rely on her more, not just as an employee but as a confidant. And though neither spoke of it aloud, there was an unspoken understanding that what they shared went beyond titles and roles. It was built on faith, on the rare kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or faked. One evening, as they stood together in the dim light of the nearly empty office, Damien turned to her with a rare look of sincerity. When I started this company, he said quietly, I thought strength meant never needing anyone. But I was wrong. Real strength is having someone you can trust completely, someone who stands their ground even when the world doubts them. You reminded me of that. Olivia felt a swell of emotion she couldn't quite contain. And you reminded me that power doesn't have to be cold, sir. It can protect, it can lead, it can lift others too. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the city stretching endlessly below them, the world moving outside while something timeless hung between them. It wasn't love yet, not the kind that burns, but the kind that heals, that begins as respect and slowly becomes the quiet recognition of two souls that see the same truth. From that day forward, their bond became the silent force behind Rhodes Enterprises' rise. Together, they weathered challenges, restructured departments, expanded markets, and rebuilt a culture of integrity that others admired. Employees began to call Olivia the heart of the company and Damien its spine, the perfect balance between compassion and command. And though they never spoke of the kiss that had started it all, it lingered in memory, not as scandal, but as the spark that set two lives on a path neither had expected, but both had needed. The months that followed the finance scandal were among the most transformative in the history of Rhodes Enterprises. The company's image, once perceived as distant and corporate, began to evolve into something more human, more authentic. Investors admired the transparency, employees felt empowered, and for the first time the building that had once carried an invisible chill of formality now felt alive with shared pride. In the center of this transformation stood Olivia Carter and Damien Rhodes, two individuals who had started from opposite worlds, brought together not by convenience or design, but by a sequence of unpredictable moments that changed the course of both their lives. To the rest of the office, they were a mystery. A CEO and his executive strategist who seemed perfectly in sync without ever crossing the lines of professionalism. Yet, beneath the surface, there existed a connection that words could never capture, built not on romance or desire, but on the kind of respect that is born when two souls recognize the same strength in each other. For Olivia, life had settled into a rhythm she never imagined possible. Her once quiet desk in the marketing department had been replaced with a corner office. Her responsibilities multiplied, her decisions now influencing the company's direction. But with every success came a weight she had never known before, the burden of leadership, the delicate balance between empathy and authority. She often thought back to the girl she had been that first day, the nervous, uncertain woman who had stumbled through the chaos of a crowded office, clutching her coffee in self-doubt, and she could hardly believe the journey that had followed. She had been humiliated in front of hundreds, doubted, accused, tested, yet every challenge had carved her into something stronger. What amazed her most wasn't the recognition or the position she now held, but the quiet inner steadiness that no longer wavered. She had found her voice. Damien, on the other hand, was facing a battle of his own, one that couldn't be solved by strategy or intellect. The company had grown beyond even his projections, expanding internationally, attracting the attention of major investors who wanted to merge or buy shares of his empire. To the outside world, he was a success story written in steel and glass, but privately, he was beginning to question everything he had built. His days had become a blur of meetings and negotiations, his nights haunted by a restless silence that no amount of achievement could fill. Power, he realized, was not the same as purpose, and the more he watched Olivia lead with compassion, the more he began to see what his life had been missing. She had reminded him that people were not numbers on a report, that leadership was not control but connection. Somewhere along the line she had become his mirror, reflecting the humanity he had long locked away. The true test came on a gray Tuesday morning that began like any other. Damien was in a meeting with board members from a multinational conglomerate, proposing a merger that would make Rhodes Enterprises part of a larger corporate network. The deal promised staggering profits, but it would also strip Damien of his authority. It would turn his creation into another faceless brand under someone else's control. The board was divided. Some argued it was the logical next step, a strategic move in a competitive economy. Others feared it would destroy the company's soul. Damien listened quietly, his expression calm, his hands folded on the table, but inside a storm was raging. For the first time in years, he didn't know what the right answer was. The logical path promised security. The emotional one demanded faith. That evening, long after the meeting ended, he found himself standing in his darkened office. The city stretched before him like a sea of fractured light. His reflection stared back from the glass, sharp, successful, and yet undeniably lonely. He thought of the empire he had built, of the sacrifices he had made, of the people he had lost along the way. Then, without even realizing it, his thoughts turned to Olivia. She was the only person he trusted to see the truth beneath the surface. Almost on instinct, he reached for his phone and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm but curious. "Sir, is everything all right?" "Come to my office," he said quietly. "There's something I need to show you." When she arrived, the lights of the city spilled through the glass like molten gold, casting soft reflections across the polished floor. Damien handed her a folder, the merger proposal. "This could make us twice as large," he said, "but it could also destroy everything we've stood for. I need your honest opinion." Olivia studied the papers, flipping through the pages slowly, then looked up at him. "What do you want to do?" she asked. He hesitated, an unfamiliar vulnerability flickering across his face. "I don't know anymore. I built this company to prove something. To the world, to myself. But lately I've been wondering if I've been building a fortress instead of a future." She closed the folder gently and met his eyes. "Then maybe the question isn't what you're building, but why. You once told me stories are what make people believe. So what story do you want this company to tell 10 years from now? That it grew because it surrendered to fear? Or that it stood its ground because it believed in its people?" Her words hit him like a breath of clarity, cutting through the fog of confusion. He looked at her for a long moment, realizing just how much she had changed him. "You've become the voice I never knew I needed," he said quietly. The kind that doesn't shout, but makes everything else go silent. The next morning, Damien walked into the boardroom with renewed purpose. The meeting stretched for hours, the debate fierce, the stakes monumental. When it ended, his decision was final. The merger was off. Rhodes Enterprises would remain independent. There would be risks, yes, but they would face them on their own terms. It was not the most profitable choice, but it was the right one. The board respected him for it, but Damien knew the real strength behind his choice had not come from logic. It had come from faith. Faith in the values Olivia had reminded him of. Faith in the humanity that made his company more than just a business. After the meeting, he found her waiting in the hallway, hands clasped nervously, searching his expression for an answer. When he nodded, relief flooded her face, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence between them said everything that words could not. In that instant, both understood that their journeys, though separate, had changed each other permanently. Months later, as spring turned the city into a canvas of light and renewal, Rhodes Enterprises held its annual conference. Damien stood before hundreds of employees, his voice steady as he addressed them. This company has survived storms, scandals, and choices that tested who we are. But the truth is, what defines a company isn't its name or its numbers, it's its people. It's those who rise when they're doubted, who stand when they could have fallen. And sometimes the greatest turning points come from the smallest mistakes, the ones that teach us who we truly are. As he spoke, his eyes found Olivia's in the crowd. She stood tall among her colleagues, her expression calm but proud, her gaze carrying the same quiet strength that had changed everything. In that moment, Damien realized that leadership wasn't about control, and redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about the courage to face truth, the humility to learn, and the grace to begin again. When the applause filled the hall, Olivia felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest, not because she was being recognized, but because she finally understood the meaning of everything that had happened. Her journey had begun with a careless sentence and a humiliating moment that she thought would end her career. But it had led her here, to purpose, to respect, to a place where her voice mattered. She had learned that sometimes life's most painful moments are not punishments but preparation. Not endings but awakenings. As the evening light bathed the glass towers in gold, Damien and Olivia stood by the window once more, the same view that had witnessed their story unfold. He glanced at her, a rare softness in his tone. "You know, Miss Carter, if you hadn't spoken that day in the office, none of this would have happened." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe it wasn't a mistake after all." "No," he said quietly, looking out at the skyline. "It was the beginning of something extraordinary. And in that quiet moment, with the city alive beneath them and the future waiting beyond the glass, both understood that the true measure of life wasn't how perfectly we avoided failure, but how deeply we learned from it. How bravely we rose after falling and how profoundly we changed along the way." The end.